Good afternoon, and welcome everyone to the London ULT for today's online seminar as we look forward to studying the subject of yoga. The seminar topic, as you may already know, is on yoga for mind and body. The practice of yoga, as taught in Patanjali Yoga Aphorism and in the perennial wisdom teaching, shows how metaphysical philosophy or the Eastern psychology of mind can improve our well-being and spirituality. Theosophical Raja Yoga was given by the Trans-Himalayan masters and endorsed by them as the most reliable way to show the path to and reveal mysteries of the spiritual life. There will be three main talks today. First talk will focus on the philosophical perspective of view on what Raja Yoga is. The second talk deals with the 8 limbs of yoga and will focus on guidance on Hatha Yoga, Pranayama, and Kundalini. We will then have a group discussion and study of the handout with Q&A. This will be followed by a 20-minute break. Next, we will have the third talk on Patanjali Yoga Aphorism practices for preparation for meditation. And this will cover subjects such as attention, contemplation, and meditation. After the third talk, we will have our second group study and discussion session of the handout with Q&A before the closing word for today's seminar, which is expected for 18:15. The program itself is been pasted in the Skype chat for those who haven't already had a look. So let's start.
Thank you. So this seminar is taking as its framework an entry titled Yoga in a pamphlet by William Q. Judge called Subjects for Discussion. It's a short pamphlet and it contains some brief sentences as talking points and thinking points on a number of different theosophical subjects. William Judge, as most of you know, was co-founder of the modern theosophical movement with H.P. Blavatsky, and her closest and most trusted colleague and co-worker. He also produced the renditions of the Bhagavad Gita and the Yoga Sutras, or aphorisms, of Patanjali that are used, studied, and frequently referred to in the United Lodge of Theosophists around the world. So his entry for yoga says, English equivalent, union, signifies the linking of the personal self to the universal self. Concentration, its greatest feature. Concentration best achieved by getting rid of those elements in the nature which prevent its accomplishment. Patanjali's system, different kinds of yoga. Raja Yoga, the highest, white magic. Tantra Yoga, the lowest, black magic. Hatha Yoga, sometimes called grey magic, the worst of all, because most delusive. Thousands of yogis in India, most of them students of Hatha Yoga, following mere forms and ceremonies, posturings, breathing exercises, and the like. A true yogi can as well be in communion at an office desk as in a cave. To be in the world, but not of the world, the position rightly to be attained by the real anchorite. Now we'll hear much more about Hatha Yoga and issues relating to it in the next talk, so we won't really go into that here. Due to Tantra Yoga being the lowest form of yoga, and in fact black magic, there's naturally nothing positive to be gained from focusing on that in this seminar. But we can deal with it just very briefly by saying that Tantra is an aspect of Hinduism and of Tibetan Buddhism. The Tantric component of Tibetan Buddhism was imported largely from India and inspired by Hindu Tantrism. But in Hinduism at large, Tantra is not very well respected at all, and is not even counted amongst the 6 schools or systems of Hindu philosophy. But in the whole of Tibetan Buddhism, including today's Gelugpa sect of the Dalai Lama, Tantra is upheld as being the most important and highest, most advanced spiritual path, and essential for achieving true enlightenment. There is much more to Tantric practice than just the sexual side of it, but H.P. Blavatsky states in the Theosophical Glossary that sexual Tantra is, quote, the worst form of black magic or sorcery. This is made plain, clear, and unambiguous. So-called sex magic is black magic. That doesn't mean it isn't powerful. It no doubt is or can be, but it involves occult misuse, or rather abuse, of the sacred and holy sexual forces and energies, and can only wreak havoc and destruction, predominantly on oneself, in the long run. So we'll leave that at that and move on to the opposite end of the yoga spectrum, white magic, which is how that passage defined Raja Yoga, the highest type of yoga. In Sanskrit, the word Raja means royal and kingly, and it's called Raja Yoga because of being considered by many as the highest, the greatest, the most noble and majestic form of yoga. Nowadays, almost everyone in the West, as soon as we hear that word yoga, we think of people doing stretching and physical exercises and complex physical postures and so on, perhaps at a yoga center for physical health and so on. That's because that type of yoga, which is Hatha Yoga, is the form of yoga that proved most popular with the body-oriented Western world. But for thousands of years in India, the unqualified word yoga by itself has been a synonym not for that, but for meditation, for internal mental practices of attaining conscious union with the divine. And that is what Raja Yoga revolves around. But nothing's ever completely simple and straightforward in life, not even in the world of spirituality. Because as soon as one tries to find out exactly what Raja Yoga is and what it consists of, one encounters numerous systems and practices, all calling themselves Raja Yoga. In many parts of the world, the first encounter that people have with this term is through an organization called the Brahma Kumaris, which is very loosely based on Hinduism. They promote Raja Yoga in a very big way with free public events, talks, and literature. Although they began in the 1930s, they claim, without any evidence, to be the world's oldest spiritual group, and say that they are the originators or inventors of Raja Yoga. When asked about Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, which is what most of the world understands as Raja Yoga, they say that Patanjali copied their ideas 2,500 years ago, but that he did so in a very imperfect way, and that there's no value in reading Patanjali. From what we understand of the Brahma Kumaris Raja Yoga, there are certainly some aspects of genuine Raja Yoga in it, such as developing the power of concentration in meditation, stilling the mind, affirming the eternal nature of the soul, and so on. But the 8 limbs or stages of Patanjali's system are not considered in it, and it differs greatly from Hindu and Theosophical Raja Yoga in that the person is required to keep their eyes open all the time during the practice, and to never close their eyes in meditation. And then, if they join the Brahma Kumaris organization, they will be expected to do this Raja Yoga while staring into the eyes of one of the group's leaders, who will be sat in front of them and staring back into their eyes for up to around 30 minutes at a time. This has apparently caused many people to have what they considered spiritual experiences of seeing flashing lights and different colors and so on. But Theosophy warns us that seeing such things is not spiritual, but of a psychic and astral nature. That doesn't necessarily mean it's bad, but we are advised to not give attention to it, and to realize its illusory nature, and that the truly spiritual transcends all such things. The eyes, writes HPB, are the most occult organ on the exterior of the body. And so we can assume that having someone stare into our eyes is not a very wise or beneficial practice. So, as we briefly mentioned a moment ago, the yoga system of the Hindu sage Patanjali is what most people mean by the term Raja Yoga. Raja Yoga, in its general usage in the world, is a synonym for Patanjali's system. Patanjali himself didn't call it Raja Yoga as far as we know. He simply called it yoga. It's also known as Ashtanga Yoga, which means the 8-limbed yoga, the eightfold yoga, because his book, the Yoga Sutras, or Yoga Aphorisms of Patanjali, lists out 8 successive stages in the practice of yoga, from the very first foundation of good ethical conduct and moral purification through to the final stage, the ultimate goal of divine self-reunion. The re-becoming in consciousness, that absolute supreme consciousness, which is the essence of everyone and everything, and which many people would call God, though Theosophy generally avoids that word because of the mistaken ideas it automatically conjures up. HPB wrote, "Read Patanjali's yoga philosophy, but with caution, for it is very apt to mislead, being written in symbolic language." And in an article she said, "He who would know more, let him study Vedanta and Patanjali's yoga philosophy esoterically." Vedanta, by the way, is the most popular and prominent of the Shad Darshanas, or 6 schools of Hindu philosophy. One of the other of the 6 schools is the yoga philosophy, by which is meant Patanjali's system, which is not the same as Vedanta and has a somewhat different philosophical framework. The Upanishads are the main scriptures of Vedanta, but the Vedanta system's most popular text is the Bhagavad Gita. William Judge once wrote in a letter to an inquirer, "The only method of yoga that I would give a snap for is that found in Patanjali's yoga and the Bhagavad Gita. True yoga is not auto-hypnotization. The true practice of yoga begins by purifying the heart. Its perfection is not attainable until the personal idea is completely uprooted. Obviously, this takes more than one incarnation. You have in you the self, all-powerful and omniscient. It cannot act because the lower self hinders it. The hindrances must be got rid of. The way to do it is in Patanjali and Bhagavad Gita. It is a long, hard, and awful road, with peace at the end. But students must measure the task and not take what they cannot do." One of the names of the Bhagavad Gita is the Book of Yoga. Hinduism and Theosophy point out that this book of 18 chapters can be divided into 3 sections of 6 chapters each. The first 6 collectively deal primarily with the form of yoga called karma yoga. The next 6 with bhakti yoga, and the final 6 with jnana yoga. None of these forms of yoga are physical exercise yoga, or gymnastic or posture yoga, or breath suppression yoga. Yoga is the aim, the goal, union. So karma yoga is seeking to attain that union through karma, which is the Sanskrit word for action and work. Karma yoga is yoga through right actions, good deeds, selfless service. Bhakti Yoga is seeking to attain yoga through bhakti, which is devotion and devotional love. Many people think bhakti means singing and praying to an anthropomorphic, external God in the sky and worshipping statues and images. And that is the approach of the Hare Krishna group, for example. But Theosophy tells us that Krishna, the teacher in the Bhagavad Gita, represents and speaks as the higher self of each of us. Atman, which is really Brahman, the supreme self, the one absolute divine principle. Therefore, real bhakti, one's spiritual devotion, is for and towards the whole of humanity. For we then see each human being as Brahman, just as we see ourselves as being Brahman in the highermost part of our spiritual nature. And then Jnana Yoga is through jnana, meaning spiritual knowledge. So we have karma, bhakti, jnana, action, devotion, knowledge, or hands, heart, head. We need all of those aspects combined and united. Some 20th century Hindu writers have called that integral yoga, or the yoga of synthesis. Raja Yoga includes all of those, but it also contains more. For Patanjali presents and lays out in very precise scientific type language the science of meditative concentration, of concentrated meditation. That is really the essence, the defining feature of Raja Yoga. In the entry for concentration in Judge's Subjects for Discussion pamphlet, he says it is to hold the mind on any object without thinking of anything but it, and adds, through concentration lies the power of raising the Kundalini, or spiritual force. The entry for Raja Yoga in the Theosophical Glossary by HPB defines it as the true system of developing psychic and spiritual powers and union with one's higher self, or the Supreme Spirit, as the profane express it. The exercise, regulation, and concentration of thought. Raja Yoga is opposed to Hatha Yoga, the physical or psychophysiological training in asceticism. So if we only remember one sentence as the perfect definition for Raja Yoga, let it be this one: the exercise, regulation, and concentration of thought. The exercise of thought, the regulation of thought, the concentration of thought. Real yoga isn't about abandoning thought, or giving up thought, or dropping the mind, or entering a so-called state of no mind. It's all about using and controlling thought and the mind. For the individual part of us, the reincarnating part of us, the part of us which wishes to achieve yoga, is, according to Theosophy, a mind entity, a thinker, individualized thought called manas, and we have to use that. Patanjali's book begins with a simple defining statement. Concentration, or yoga, is the hindering of the modifications of the thinking principle. Another translation has it as yoga is the restriction of thought waves. Yoga is the restriction of thought waves. That doesn't mean abandoning all thinking and thought from here onwards, like popular Zen and Krishnamurti and other systems promote. If one reads on, it's seen that Patanjali is talking about the particular period of time in which one is sitting to meditate. For the duration of that, all thought waves or mind modifications or vrittis have to be restricted or hindered or prevented, and the mind instead held on one particular specific focus of concentration without wavering. That is, on one particular specific object of thought. And what that thing can be is gone into later by Patanjali. Another great historical figure of Hinduism is Adi Shankaracharya. While modern scholars place him for dubious reasons around the 8th century AD, Theosophy and many Hindus give evidence for him having lived 2,500 years ago. Theosophy even says that the soul of Gautama Buddha reincarnated, in a sense, within Shankaracharya 50 years after Buddha's death. We mentioned the Vedanta system of Hindu philosophy. Shankara founded the Advaita Vedanta. Advaita meaning non-duality, non-dualism, universal oneness, ideas which are thankfully increasingly popular and increasingly widespread nowadays. He's most well known for popularizing jnana yoga, yoga through knowledge, and classifying the different stages of jnana yoga. But he also taught a system of Raja Yoga, which is Vedantic Raja Yoga. The Raja Yoga of Shankaracharya is found in his text Aparokshanubhuti and is a 15-fold system, a 15-limbed yoga science. Patanjali's is 8-fold, Shankara's is 15-fold. With Shankara, 8 of those are the same as Patanjali's 8 limbs, but he adds a further 7 to them. He also clarifies the issue of asanas, or postures, and pranayama, or breath suppression, which in Patanjali's book are presented literally and on the physical level, which Theosophy and Shankara say is not necessary at all and can prove harmful. But I believe that will be gone into in the next talk in a moment. So now we've briefly looked at Tantra Yoga, Karma Yoga, Bhakti Yoga, Jnana Yoga, and more specifically Raja Yoga, the Raja Yoga of the Brahma Kumaris movement, and the more genuine and real Raja Yoga of Patanjali and Shankaracharya. Finally, what about the Raja Yoga of Theosophy? If you've attended any ULT meetings, you've almost definitely heard the speakers or attendees speaking of Raja Yoga. And it would be natural to assume that what they mean is Patanjali's system, seeing as that's what almost everyone, everywhere, means by this term, Raja Yoga. And often we may have given the impression that by Raja Yoga, Theosophy means Patanjali's book. But if we have implied that, we shouldn't have done, because in the study of Theosophy we learn that the real Raja Yoga precedes Patanjali. He did not invent it. He was not the first person to teach or promote it. And in fact, real Raja Yoga contains much, much more than is found in Patanjali's yoga aphorisms. Remember, the glossary said Raja Yoga is the true system of developing or unfolding spiritual and psychic powers and faculties. While those who we call the masters of wisdom, the Mahatmas, the adepts, their initiated brotherhood, to which HPB, WQJ, and others belong, certainly possessed the true system of development for millions of years prior to Patanjali. In the book The Voice of the Silence, which HPB translated from the Book of the Golden Precepts, we get some precious glimpses of the Raja Yoga system of the Trans-Himalayan Brotherhood, or Lodge, or esoteric school, that brotherhood which is most closely and directly linked with our Theosophical movement. And we see that it does contain stages closely corresponding to those of Patanjali, but sometimes described somewhat differently, and with additional information, including that every stage of development in Raja Yoga is symbolized by a geometrical figure, and also including the all-important Bodhisattva path and the practice of the paramitas, or golden virtues, not in a merely moralistic sense, but as definite portals and gateways of initiation. Initiation that leads to becoming a bodhisattva, a nirmanakaya, an adept who who reaches to, but renounces the eternal bliss of nirvana, or total reabsorption in the infinite, in order to stay with humanity, to remain on the earth or in the psychic atmosphere of the earth to help, teach, and guide suffering humanity out of boundless compassion for as long as all life continues. Patanjali's book is absolutely silent about all of that. Not just about the geometrical figures, but about the bodhisattva ideal, the bodhisattva path, about initiation, and about the type of divine compassion for humanity that's described in none of the world's religions except Mahayana Buddhism. So while we can say that Patanjali is apparently correct in his exposition of Raja Yoga, we can say he is correct, but we cannot say that he is complete, for he misses out some very important components. But if we study Patanjali alongside the voice of the silence, we then get a broader and much more fruitful, fulfilling, and rewarding realization of the Raja Yoga system of those who Theosophists call the Masters. Even so, it's still very incomplete, for in some places HPB reveals that the Raja Yoga of the Masters school contains many aspects that humanity is not fit or ready or capable of handling at this point in time, including, for example, theurgy and practical occultism, white magic in all its potency and force, as well as things we would simply not be able to understand due to their being so esoterically and metaphysically complex. As Mr. Judge says, we must first fully and deeply understand the theosophy we have been given, if we would ever hope to be given more. And that itself is the work of lifetimes. But we can rest assured that in the voice of the silence, in Patanjali's sutras, in the Bhagavad Gita, in Light on the Path, and in all the other books, we have more than enough to be able to make significant progress if we will only make the effort. In the royal yoga, the kingly yoga, the queenly yoga, the Raja yoga. And now for the second talk.
Thank you, Matiana, for this lovely introduction. I'm going to start sharing my screen now. Please do let me know whether you can see the slides.
Yeah, we can see them fine, Anya.
Okay. Okay. Right. Well, I like what you said about that a potential aspirant to be called a yogi must measure the effort ahead of him before he even attempts this trial, let's say. And we are going to now look at 8 limbs of Raja Yoga, which is a very logical, very well organized system. And only after this short introduction we can really see whether we are up for it or not. Because indeed, Hatha Yoga would constitute just a tiny portion, if that, of the whole 8-limb system of Raja Yoga. But we'll get to it. So in this slide, you can see a wheel consisting of 8 limbs, specified, formulated by Patanjali. And in order to understand it, we would have to compare it to a clock, to an analog clock face, starting with yamas, which are more external, focusing on our role in the external world, and then slowly, gradually, as we go around, becoming more and more internal, until we end up reaching our goal, which is samadhi, the final state of yoga, the union with the divine. You will see the names of each limb in Sanskrit, and then underneath you will have English terms used by and suggested by William Q. Judge. So we've got yamas, niyama, or niyamas, since there are 5 of those as well, asanas, pranayama, pratyahara, dharana, dhyana, and samadhi. Let me just move to the next slide, which is here. We can divide the whole system of 8 limbs into limb 1, limb 2, then 3, 4, and 5 go kind of together, and then final 3, 6, 7, and 8 would go are kind of linked together, and they will be spoken about in our 3rd talk today. The most important ones for us, I suppose, are the first 2, yamas and niyamas. Yamas are called by William Q. Judge, or referred to as forbearance. And right here below, we've got 5 subdivisions of yamas. Okay, yamas, forbearance, constitute the great vow, so-called, and basically you might find them in many different ethical systems in the world. The first one is ahimsa, non-violence, non-killing, or non-hurting. In fact, we are not just talking about actions here, but this non-violence would refer to our thoughts and deeds. Next one would be satya, truthfulness, or as William Judge refers to it, veracity. A virtuous man should seek refuge in truthfulness with all his heart, says the yogic tradition. Indeed, without truthfulness, our efforts for further development on this path will be hindered. The third of those 5 yamas is asteya, which is translated as non-stealing. And asteya is closely related to the first of those yamas, ahimsa, since an unauthorized appropriation of things of value from another person obviously causes the person pain, suffering, and some sort of discomfort. Hence, it is linked to it is considered a violent act, and those 2 might go together. The 4th yama is brahmacharya, which would be translated as moderation or continence. Sometimes is referred to as Brahmanic conduct. For example, in terms of chastity. However, since in the more general sense, I think it would be more useful for us to see brahmacharya in a more general sense, talking about moderation in everything we do. In stricter orders that would consider chastity in terms of the fact that by refraining from any sexual activity, we can focus or bring our attention more to focus on the divine, which is the ultimate goal of yoga. But I think for us, as lay chelas more, we could think about, well, anything that really takes us away from focusing on the divine, we must treat with moderation. The final of those 5 yamas is aparigraha, which means non-hoarding, non-coveting. Or in some other sources, they might talk about greedlessness. The disadvantage, obviously, of hoarding things or even accepting gifts sometimes arises from the fact that we become dependent on possessions and on material things. And hence, we might grow attachment to those. And by attachment, what comes is the fear of losing those things. So these would be 5 yamas. Then we've got niyamas, or as William Judge puts it, religious observances. As yamas are more related to the external discipline, so the way we act in society and the way we interact with others, niyamas are already a little bit more internal. And we also have got 5 of those, as you can see here. And the 5 niyamas are sauka, purity or purification of soul and body. This purity we can understand in the widest possible sense. Obviously, we are talking about bodily and mental purity. It will heighten the yogin's sensitivity and might lead to a certain distance towards one's body. We also know that it might be accompanied by the desire to avoid close contact with other beings in the process. The second niyama would be santosha, or contentment. It will be the result of yogin's detachment from worldly objects. But perhaps more importantly, it will become his self-reliance in the longer run. Yes? And his mind should be concentrating solely on the supreme good of emancipation here. Now, it might be it is often linked to equanimity that we are going to hear about in the third talk a little bit more. Yes, and you can read about in the Bhagavad Gita as well. It's this, in its highest manifestation, it will be all-embracing vision of saneness. Everywhere and in everything the yogin beholds but the one. Now the next 2, tapas and svadhyaya, are probably the most archaic elements of yoga. And tapas relates to self-discipline or austerities. Now, obviously, the purpose of tapas is to strengthen and perfect their body, the physical body, indeed. However, it must not deteriorate into senseless self-torture or self-mortification. And sometimes, unfortunately, it does, which is how it is. It just shows us what a fine line actually separates us from making mistakes here. Svadhyaya, self-study, or inaudible matterings, as William Judge refers to svadhyaya in his translation of Patanjali's system, Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. is basically, it stands for the absorption into the sacred literature and for the simultaneous mental concentration and introversion. Those inaudible mutterings, it might sound a little bit strange perhaps, but basically William Jett refers here to meditative recitation, which as a matter of fact might be silent or aloud. Yes, what matters here is what we recite, and we refer to sacred text, to holy text here. Finally, the final of those 5 niyamas is Ishvara Pranidhana, surrender or persevering devotion to the Supreme Soul. And well, it is in a way related to what Matjana mentioned before, the idea of karma yoga, when a yogin is offering up all his deeds to the Supreme Teacher, yes, with love and devotion. Now, after mentioning what yamas and niyamas are, we can now think. We've just mentioned the first 2 limbs, okay? So how we can just have a little self-check, how well we are coping with those, yes, before we move on to anything else. These are extremely important because those 2 limbs might prevent you from developing, from getting into trouble of practicing Hatha Yoga on a purely physical and pranic level. So Hatha Yoga, this system of 8 limbs is in a way ordered in such a way to keep the practitioner safe. Because now we've got the limbs 3, 4, and 5, which are linked. 3 being postures or asanas, so the physical position of the body. Number 4 is suppression of the breath, pranayama. It's the control of the life force of our prana. By the way we breathe, inhale and exhale, and the moments of short retention in between, yes? And then finally we've got restraint or pratyahara, which is the final withdrawal of the senses, going more within, from the and stopping our attention from being distracted by the external stimuli. Now, those 3 are indeed related. However, we know that it really depends on an individual, because we can easily skip limb 3 and 4 and move to pratyahara or even further if we are ready. Yes. Now, initially, in Patanjali's system, makes a reference to asana being just a comfortable posture, getting ready with cross-legged. It would be a cross-legged posture that helps us to calm ourselves and prepare for further development. However, through the tantric tradition and the influence of tantra, more and more asanas were added and so on and so forth. And I think this is the problem, that some of those physical postures are quite demanding. And yes, indeed, you have to be focused in order to achieve them. But performing any asanas, no matter how difficult they might be to achieve, without, obviously, yamas and niyamas, and the intention of reaching the goal, which is the union with the divine, is completely pointless. And I think this is what makes Hatha Yoga a little bit, ridiculous if taken out from the whole system. Right, so there's not really much to say more about postures. Maybe we can focus a little bit on suppression of the breath from the yogic perspective. Yes, we are here. We are trying to control our life force, which is prana, which is the breath, right? And it's all about, if we are very much again, it depends on an individual. If we are very much distracted and we cannot really meditate on the divine, or, well, every of those limbs is a slow preparation to achieve this meditation on the divine. So this element of the whole system is supposed to bring our attention to breathing, to this rhythm. It's a natural rhythm that we've got. Inhalation, moment of retention, exhalation, moment of retention, and so on and so forth. It's a cycle. It's a rhythm. It calms our mind. Any forceful retention of the breath will be injurious, and it's not recommended by any system. Besides, that would be the violation of the first of the yamas, ahimsa. Finally, when we got to this moment of stability, mental stability, physical stability, we can start withdrawing our senses from the external world. Yes, that would be pratyahara now. We should not perceive sound with our ears, not feel, touch with our skin. Yes, we should not perceive form with our eyes, not taste tastes with our tongues. Okay. And obviously we should also abstain from all smells, as these might also interfere with our withdrawal. Now, after the fifth limb, when we manage to achieve those limbs, and we are slowly getting to the point when we are very attentive, we've got attention, we can direct now our attention, which is the sixth limb, dharana. So first we've got pratyahara and now dharana. Attention, some people call it concentration, just for your knowledge, but obviously in Theosophical teachings, concentration is the whole thing, the whole system of union, of yoga is called concentration. So attention is basically one-pointedness, in the ability of us to direct our mind towards a definite object. And then from this moment onwards, once we achieve one-pointedness, we can now, well, we have to maintain this attention, and that becomes dhyana, contemplation of this object. Sometimes dhyana might be referred to as meditative absorption. And this is when we manage to hold objects in our mind. And this object fills the entire consciousness space within us. Now, at this point, we can now start going a little bit further into ecstasy or meditation called samadhi. When we become one, we achieve the union with the divine. It's the moment of lucidity, of clarity, as some who've achieved it might describe it. But we will talk, and this is the moment when all those whirls or vritti of the ordinary waking consciousness are fully restricted in this absorption, which mentioned Matiana before. But we'll talk a little bit more about this in the third talk. I've got 2 more slides because I'm looking at the time and I know I'm going a little bit beyond it. Relate to the exoteric, perhaps, your yogic experiences of people. So we've got Lord Shiva here, sitting in a cross-legged lotus position, Padmasana here. And but the quote comes from the Voice of the Silence that was so recommended when dealing with the Patanjali system. And this image I like especially because the whole Kundalini energy is focused in Shiva's heart, and I think this is the purpose. Yes? So let not thy heaven-born spiritual ego merge into the sea of Maya, break from the universal parent, soul, but let the fiery power retire into the inmost chamber, the chamber of the heart, inner chamber of the heart, and the abode of the world's mother, Kundalini. And just to finish off, something that very light-hearted, I think, the practice of Hatha Yoga of the system obviously precedes Patanjali, and the proof for it are, for example, those little figurines that were found in the Indus Valley and are thousands of years old. They belong to Harappan and Mohenjo-Daro civilizations that basically existed and flourished between now dried up river Sarasvati and Indus, which is still there in the western part, or to the west of the Himalaya and Himalayas mountains, and to the west of the Indian subcontinent. Thank you very much. And now I'm going to stop sharing. And I would like to invite Will.
Well, thank you very much for that, Emma. So let's go on now. We've heard quite a lot about the what of the theory of yoga and the why of the ethics, but this really will be more about the how of the mechanics of what's actually happening in our different principles during yoga and concentration. And we'll talk about things, Hatha Yoga aspects, and Pranayama, which we've heard mentioned, and also Kundalini, which was mentioned and is very much talked about now, but somewhat misunderstood. Now, in some Hatha Yoga circles, you'll see there's a lot made of the lotus symbol there at the top of the screen. And HPP writes in The Secret Doctrine that the lotus is the emblem of the productive power of nature. It's a symbol of the productive power of nature through the agency of fire and water, in other words, spirit and matter. And it's therefore she calls it a twofold type. There's the divine aspect of the fire aspect, and the human or water or human hermaphrodite water aspect to it. Now, many of you will know this trinity and quaternary division of man's being. Now, we need to really understand a little bit of this before we can begin to make sense of Raja Yoga. So you know that we have this lower quaternary. This is the temporary man. It contains, reading from the bottom upwards, our physical body, the sthula, the lingasarira, the astral, the pranic body, and the kama principle, which has captivated part of our mind. Part of that higher manas is captivated by kama, and it's the antaskaranic bridge or link, which then is the purpose of our current evolution, is to raise the mind up, to purify the kamic mind and unite it with the higher mind, manas. And after that we have buddhi and atma, which are the monad, and or you could say the higher self, and the ego, which is permanent. And between incarnations we keep the same permanent trinity. Whereas the quaternary is transitory. We only have it for one life normally, unless we die very young, in which case the linga sharira may survive until the next life. Now, the key, or one of the keys to yoga, is seeing that Raja Yoga generally deals with the permanent man, the trinity. and that Hatha Yoga concentrates more on these lower four aspects of the astral body, the prana, the physical body. And as we said, the aim is to try to purify the kamic mind and unite it with its spiritual parent, which is simply what it is a reflection of in the first place. Hence the idea of a pilgrimage and a return to the source. The source of our personality is the higher individuality. Now, what is Kundalini? How does it figure in all this? Well, it's known to be a vital force, and it runs through all the principles, the pranic, astral, manasic. And most importantly, it should be kept free and balanced. And so it seems as though this Kundalini, we'll read about it later on. The Kundalini energy is spiritual, but when it starts off in the lower chakras, it's not particularly pure. I mean, it's because it's rising up, and it has to be purified by some of the practices that we heard about from Anya, like the yamas. These are all things which are going to purify our Kundalini. Because don't forget, the Kundalini seems to be always operating. So what comes next is, we ought to just say also that the astral body is probably one of the most important things to understand in this. Judge and Blavatsky use the term ethereal body sometimes, or inner body, or subtle body. It's, by the way, if you're used to reading some of the later Theosophists, they talk about the etheric body. That's not actually the astral body. It's slightly different. It's something between it's not very clear actually what it is, but it's something between the physical body and the astral. But we don't use that term, and neither did Judge or HPB. The etheric body was something that was invented later. Now, what about this working of the astral body? Judge says that it has a complete system of nerves and arteries of its own, and that these convey an astral fluid, which we assume is one of the Kundalini energies, which is like the blood of the physical body. It's the astral blood. And these inner currents emanate from their own centers, the chakras. If Judge or HPB talks about centers, they're normally talking about the chakras. And that they're constantly in motion. And interestingly, they are affected by thoughts. So these internal magnetic currents are affected by our thought. And also, they're a reflection of the physical body as it goes through its physiological changes. And Judge says that they act upon each other incessantly. In other words, there's a constant communication running up and down the principles. There's constant intercommunication between those principles. And it's by means of those subtle currents, they're sometimes called vital airs, that impressions are conveyed to the mind above. So you can see the mind, either the kama or the higher mind. These impressions are conveyed up and down this ladder. And in the Voice of the Silence, Kundalini is said to be an electro-spiritual force, a creative power, which when aroused into action can kill as easily as it can create. It's sometimes called the fiery power of life. And we'll read more about that in the handout at the end of this talk. We'll have some time to study the handout. Now, what else is said about this? One important point is the astral spinal column has these nerves, which are made up of the same sort of matter, these magnetic currents. They may be called the ways or channels, up and down which forces play that enable man inside and outside to feel and to act. I mean, that's very similar to what he said on the previous slide, is that these this intercommunication informs the whole body and keeps everything communicating with everything else. But this is not on the physical plane. This is on the astral plane, so it's more connected with probably feelings, desires, emotions, those types of things. Judge says that they correspond to magnetic fluid, and they're respectively positive, negative, and neutral. Now, there's a footnote there. They're called the Ida, the Pingala, and the Sushumna, the three magnetic currents that run up and down the spine. And he said this is very important, that their regular balance is essential to sanity. Now, that's sometimes you see people who are practicing pranayama or different hatha yoga practices, they get out of balance. They're not, it's hard to describe really. It can happen in many different ways. They become very excitable or passionate or unreasonable or extreme. They lose their sanity partly. And he says that when the astral spine reaches the inner brain, these nerves become more complex and have the final great outlet in the skull. And there is a channel that runs up through into the top of the head. We'll talk about that. Well, actually, it's in this next entry from the glossary by HPB. Now, the Sushumna is this central, neutral channel that goes up the middle of the spine. And that's, she describes as the solar ray, the first of the 7 rays, and also the name, the spinal nerve, which connects the heart. We'll talk more about the heart later, with the Brahmarandra. The Brahmarandra is the 1,000-petaled lotus at the top of the head, which Judge says connects us with the solar forces. And that plays an important part in yoga. Now, we've spoken a little bit about the solar. There's an analogy that is used between the solar and the lunar energies. And the Secret Doctrine compares this spiritual connection which we're making to that of raising one's mental energy to its solar source, or you could say the atomic source of the universal mind, or Mahat, the Atma Buddhi, through the use of meditation and the development of the heart qualities. Because you remember that the Brahmarandra is connected through the Sushumna nerve to the heart. And it's from the heart, as that nice quotation that Anna gave us from the voice. The Kundalini has to retire into the heart. And then from the heart, it then rises up into the brain. Now, in the Secret Doctrine, she gives a commentary from the Pistis Sophia. That's a lovely analogy of this whole process. She says, Sophia Akamoth is shown lost in the waters of chaos or matter, on her way to the supreme light, and Christos delivering and helping her on the right path. And we can say that Sophia Akamoth here really is the personal astral psychic entity. And that gets lost it's imprisoned in this labyrinth of matter. but it's saved by the higher self, which is the Christos principle. And this is just how Raja Yoga saves the psychic or lunar Sophia Akamoth, which is, you could say, is part of the quaternary, by raising it to a pure blissful union with the solar trinity, which is initially in the heart and later expands into the spiritual sun. When it rises from the heart, it comes up into the head and then can make contact through the Brahmarandra nadi at the top of the head, and make contact with the sun, the spiritual sun, which is more cosmic than human. Now, all that training, which we read about in the 8 limbs, is needed for the lower mind to let go of that quaternary, of those lower material spheres. So let's go to the handout now, and we're going to read some quotations and study them together. So the first ones will be from the talk on Raja Yoga.
I was going to, rather than go straight to the handout for the first talk, ask first if there are any questions or comments relating to the first talk. You can type them in the chat box or unmute and speak them.
Matiana, just a question about 5 paragraphs down in the handout. It says an unmistakable error confounds the Raja with the Hatha Yogas, whereas the former having nothing to do with the physical training of the Hatha Yoga, nor with any other of the innumerable sects who have now adopted the name and emblems of yogins. It strikes me that it's possible, or it seems to me anyway, that most of the schools of yoga that we see, most of them being focused on physical positions, etc., pranayama, and not so much on the asanas, if at all, that there's an ignorance there based in a couple of things. And I wonder what you think about that. That is to say, to some extent, the world of yoga today is pretty much ignorant of any other world of yoga, thinking that the positioning, breathing, etc., is what yoga is. Although each of us is responsible, obviously, for what we think is true, nonetheless, the world seems to have been conditioned to think that yoga really is pretty much positioning.
I think that's certainly true for most people who do the more physical exercise, health-oriented Hatha Yoga. And we should perhaps explain at this point that the term Hatha Yoga is also not a single unified system. For example, there's the Hatha Yoga of Hinduism, and there's the Hatha Yoga of the modern day Western world, though it's also practiced in other parts of the world. So most people who do Hatha Yoga aren't doing it in a religious context or with the aim of reaching union with the divine or developing psychic powers. They're doing it for the sake of better physical health and peace of mind. And there's innumerable sports centers, yoga centers, gymnastic groups, health groups that do that form of Hatha Yoga all over the world, which, although it may have some risks of its own, that's obviously the much safer form of Hatha Yoga in general. And the people who do that, probably many of them, as you say, are not aware that there is anything more to yoga than that, because that's the idea that's been given to us in the West in the past few decades, is yoga equals physical stretching, physical exercises, physical postures, for physical health. But those who do the more ancient type of religious Hindu or Hindu-esque Hatha Yoga, I would assume, are aware that there are other yoga systems, including Raja Yoga, but for whatever reason they consider their Hatha Yoga to be better, either in general or better for them personally. Pilar asked in the chat box, are there unconscious Raja Yogis? Which I assume means, can you be a Raja Yogi without knowing it? And I think the answer to that is yes, it is possible. A person may practice and develop concentration and those different things under different names without ever knowing that it's the same as what Hindus and Theosophists would call Raja Yoga. But also, it's also possible to carry over from a previous lifetime development that may have been attained in Raja Yoga. William Judge writes in a few places that if you develop yourself in Hatha Yoga, that will largely, if not entirely, be lost at death because it relates so much to the temporary personal self, whereas development achieved in Raja Yoga becomes a part of the reincarnating immortal being and will be carried over and will express itself in some form in the next lifetime. And Laurie asked or commented, the Hatha Yoga practices seem more focused on body-mind unity versus union with lower self and higher self. That is correct. I assume that the Hatha Yogis would say that their practices do unite the lower self with the higher self. And in one of the quotes in the handout, it's the quote that begins, an unmistakable error, the same one that Steve referred to. A few lines down, HPB says, it is not that among the Hatha Yogins there has never been a man worthy of being considered as a true yogi. So she says the Hatha Yoga practice has produced some people who are worthy of being considered true yogis. But she says what we say is simply this: the Raja Yogi trains but his mental and intellectual powers, leaving the physical alone, and making but little of the exercise of phenomena simply of a physical character. Whereas those things are very much what the Hindu Hatha Yoga is based on and focused around. And the quotes in the handout start with that definition that was shared in the first talk of Raja Yoga being the true system of developing psychic and spiritual powers. So psychic powers, their development is not a bad thing, but the true system of developing them is in the real Raja Yoga, which also develops spiritual powers, and it's the true system of union with the higher self, and it's defined as the exercise of thought, notice not the exercise of body. And in the comments we're making, we're not saying that we should not exercise the physical body, because of course the physical body does need its adequate physical exercise for the sake of physical health, but that is more simply common sense than having to make it part of yoga practice. Raja Yoga is the exercise of thought, the regulation of thought, the concentration of thought. And a couple of weeks ago in a Sunday meeting, we studied the articles titled The Culture or the Cultivation of Concentration, that being how Raja Yoga is defined. Lay shared a comment which we should probably take up in relation to the second talk.
Well, let's take up Lay's and Steve's question. So Lay was asking about a quotation from Patanjali. When veracity is complete, veracity is truthfulness. The yogi becomes the focus for the karma resulting from all works, good or bad. And the question is, does the focus for the karma mean when one completes veracity, his or her karma will be manifested sooner for him or her to work out? Yes, that's very, very true. It's put there in a very striking way that he becomes the focus for karma. And I think it's well known that when you begin to tread the path and to try to put your life in order, then things do begin to accelerate for you more, because one of the maxims of karma is that when the lesson is learned, then the karma finishes, and you're able to then create conditions to experience new karma. So as you begin to work through and change one's life, you create new conditions for new karma. So that seems to precipitate on you more quickly. So I think that's a very good observation. And something actually we ought to warn each other about, because life does become more difficult in some ways. It also becomes much better in other ways, because the karma that we precipitate is sometimes very good karma, not always bad karma. And then Steve's comment was that Theosophical studies seem to make quite important the awareness of the inner man. Yes, that's right. And to assist the explanations regarding the inner man. There are a number of graphics, as was just presented. What would be a way to balance the look of the graphics and how the inner man is in reality?
Did we not say that to balance from the graphic that you show, to balance between the lower quaternary and the higher, use the antascaronal bridge?
Yes.
Which is, yeah.
Yeah, the antascarana is the link between the triangle and the quaternary. Well, that's a difficult question. Anyone got any ideas?
And of course, those in plain words, it means to all those things that we've been talking about the practice, put into practice all those 8 limbs, and of course, the concentration of mind. All these practices will lead to balancing the two, to making the lower porous to the higher, I guess, to the inner man.
Yes, I mean, the way that HPB put it in The Secret Doctrine, that Sophia Akamoth, who's this astral psychic entity that's trapped in matter, is rescued by the Christos principle, or the higher self, I think is a very nice way of putting that a bit less graphically, but it's still a powerful image. the Christos comes down and helps the trapped entity. So, well, let's read some of these quotations. So, who'd like to read? Well, we know about the Eightfold Path, but let's read from Hatha Yoga. Yeah, perhaps someone would like to read that down to the culture concentration. Any volunteers? Don't be shy.
I can read if you like.
Oh yeah, thanks, Laurie.
Sure. Hatha Yoga is a practical mortification of the body by means of which certain powers are developed. It consists in the assumption of certain postures that aid the work and certain kinds of breathing that bring on changes in the system, together with other devices. These risks consist in this, that while an undirected person is doing according to the rules of Hatha Yoga, he arouses in him influences that do him harm. Being attracted to Hatha Yoga by the novelty of it and by the apparent pay that it offers in visible physical results, they begin without knowledge of the difficulty, and stopping after a period of trial, they bring down upon themselves consequences that are wholly undesirable. The greatest objection to it, however, is that it pertains to the material and semi-material man, roughly speaking, to the body, and what it gained through it is lost at death. The Bhagavad Gita refers to this and describes what happens in these words. All of these, indeed, being versed in sacrifice, have their sins destroyed by these sacrifices. But he alone reaches union with the Supreme Being, who eats of the ambrosia left from a sacrifice. This means that the Hatha Yoga practice represents the mere sacrifice itself, whereas the other kind is the ambrosia arising from the sacrifice, or the perfection of spiritual cultivation. And that leads to nirvana. The means for attaining the perfection of spiritual cultivation are found in Raj Yoga, or as we shall term it for the present, culture of concentration.
Okay, thanks, Laurie. Are there any questions on that?
Could I just maybe, it's not a question, but I would like to make a comment regarding the last paragraph that Laurie has just read, talking about ambrosia. Okay. Well, Hatha Yoga is very popular in the West because it makes people feel better. They say, oh, they feel more relaxed, they feel calmer, and so on and so forth, which is great. But obviously, it doesn't mean that they are in union with the divine. It's a psychic power. It's a psychic, emotional experience that they witness. So I think William Q. Judge is talking about, okay, so once you get to this nice, calm disposition, what are you going to do about it? Okay, so it's all you are now, you've prepared now your mind a little bit more, you've prepared your body a little bit more. So if you are calmer and if you are in a good mood, then I guess the time comes to do something really important. Maybe use this moment to help other people, or so on and so forth. So I think that's what he means when he talks about ambrosia and the meaning of the sacrifice. Yeah.
Oh, interesting thought, Anya. Thank you. Hadn't looked at it that way.
No, you're welcome. I'm learning as we go along, as you know. So.
Yeah, I mean, that's something we have been discussing during the preparation for the talks, is that yoga is so popular in the West, and that that we sometimes see undesirable consequences of people who've, effectively developed it so far that they've begun to raise their Kundalini and not prepared themselves morally for that. But most of the time, the Hatha Yoga is done, as you said, just for health and relaxation, and it doesn't involve, or probably involves very little psychic development or Kundalini awakening.
I agree.
Okay, shall we go on to the next quote that Anya selected? Someone else like to read that one? It's when he hath renounced all intentions.
I can read.
Yeah, thank you, Lei.
When he has renounced all intentions and is devoid of attachment to action in regard to objects of sense, then he is called one who has ascended to meditation. He should raise the self by the self. Let him not suffer the self to be lowered, for self is the friend of self. And in like manner, self is its own enemy. The man who has spiritual knowledge and discernment, who stands upon the pinnacle and has subdued the senses, to whom gold and stone are the same, is said to be devoted, and he is esteemed among all whom, whether among his friends and companions, in the midst of enemies, or those who stand aloof or remain natural, with those who love and those who hate, and in the company of sinners or the righteous, is of equal mind. From Bhagavad Gita.
Thank you. So this is what Anya mentioned about equanimity. It's being regarding gold and stone indifferently, not to be concerned when you're surrounded by people who are, well, as Judge puts it here, the company of sinners. So could be your drug dealer or whatever it is, local mugger. It's not to love and to hate, particularly in respect to those outward things. So are there any questions? Did you want to say anything, Anya, about any other points before we go on?
I was just typing this comment that thank you very much for saying that, because unfortunately in modern times people are very quick to judge. Yes, and what we need to remain quite open-minded to see that this person that we are so angry with, that we are so judgmental about, is really in a way reflection of ourselves. Or very often if something really irritates us about other people, perhaps it is what irritates us about ourselves. So this is this other sense of equanimity, that we just we are all part of the same spiritual realm. So yes, let's just not be judgmental. I really like the comment that you've made, last comment.
Yes, well, it's. I suppose it's part of the fifth limb, isn't it, pratyahara, where you turn your senses away from the outside world, at least during the time of your meditation, and you lose concern for it. You're more concerned about states and conditions of consciousness and one's own faults and things that we should really be paying attention to rather than other people's failures.
Also, we've got a very interesting question from, I'm not sure who that is, from S.
Sunny, yeah.
Sunny. Can somebody I guess, explain the difference between Kundalini and Prana. I think Will has explained it very nicely during his talk, but maybe using very simple words, I can explain. Prana is energy. Yes, it's energy. Kundalini would be more ethereal. It would be like almost electric impulses that run through our nervous system. Please correct me if I'm oversimplifying it, but so Kundalini would be more subtle than Prana.
Anya, could we say that prana means it's the life force?
The life force, yes.
The life force in the body, or the chi, or the ki, as it's called in China and Japan. Whereas Kundalini is said to be a spiritual energy. It's actually been equated with the Holy Spirit in Christian terms, a divine force, a divine power, actually, which once you become active in the human being through all these practices of the 8 limbs under one name or another, the person it transforms the human being into from an ordinary man or the animal into a divine human being, or a saint, we could say, a yogi, a bodhisattva. So it is said to reside in the sacral chakra, the lowest, at the bottom of the spine, and under the right conditions, it rises, as was said, to the heart, and then from the heart to the Brahma Randra, the crown chakra. So it's a different. I think it's a much higher vibration of energy, or still energy, of course, but a different quality altogether, I think, from prana.
Yes, thanks, David. Matiana's answered Pilar's question. Jiva is a term used in many contexts, ranging from a synonym for prana to a synonym for the Manasaputra to a synonym for the monad. Yes, jiva is the universal energy, atma jiva sometimes, and in some cases having a more universal meaning than the human individual prana. Yes, that's right. Yeah, I think David answered it well to say the Kundalini is like a specialized form of prana that flows in these spinal column channels, the Ida, Pingala, and the Sushumna.
But in an earlier comment, responding to Sunny's question, as said, the voice of the silence says that Kundalini is what transforms the person into an enlightened, godlike being, and the same is not said about prana.
Yeah, thanks, Nathan. So let's read a little bit more about Kundalini and Pranayama and how they relate to each other, and the difference between Raja Yoga. Well, I think we've probably done enough actually on the difference between Raja Yoga and Hatha Yoga. So let's go on to Patanjali. So who'd like to read from on Patanjali? Anybody?
I don't mind reading. Will.
Anya, yeah, thanks, Anya.
No problem. On Patanjali. Read Patanjali's yoga philosophy, but with caution, for it is very apt to mislead, being written in symbolic language. And that was from Answers to Correspondence in Lucifer magazine by HPB. He who would know more, let him study Vedanta and Patanjali's yoga philosophy. I think it's partly what Matiana has said before. On postures, asanas. the posture assumed by a yogi must be steady and pleasant. In his note on this, W.Q. Judge says, for the clearing up of the mind of the student, it is to be observed that the postures laid down in various systems of yoga are not absolutely essential to the successful pursuit of the practice of concentration and attainment of its ultimate fruits. That's from his translation of Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. Who among the many thousands of members thus lead the life? Shall anyone say because he studies the Bhagavad Gita or the yoga philosophy upside down, that he is a theosophist according to the master's hearts? As it is not the cowl that makes the monk, so no long hair with a poetical vacancy on the brow are sufficient to make of one a faithful follower of divine wisdom. The Theosophical Mahatmas by HPB.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Anna. We'll just pause there for a minute. So the third limb of Patanjali is the asanas. I think it's the third limb, isn't it, Anya?
Yes, yes.
The postures. And here Judge is saying, well, you don't actually need to adopt any special posture in order to meditate or, because it's essentially a mental process of freeing the mind from the captivity of the outside world. Yeah, Anya.
However, I had to smile to myself as I was reading those rather highly ironic statements, but however, in order to be able to perform some of the inversions and balancing poses, you need to be very, very focused. You need this one-pointedness, because otherwise there is no way you can, for example, do a headstand or some other poses. However, I think, again, what they try to say, even if you have a perfect headstand, it means nothing. It is nothing for the immortal man, because, well, you can do it. It is just relevant for practice of concentration for this period of time and nothing else. But obviously they teach us about taking it to the next level or skip it altogether so that you don't get derailed or detracted somewhere there on the way.
Yeah, good observation. Lei has raised his hand.
Oh yeah, about this, I read some literature about the Shankara when he talked about the pranayama, which is actually worked with our thoughts. Kind of in the pranayama, we have the inhale, retention, and exhale. And how they work with the thought is when inhale, we kind of establish the thought of I'm that. And then retention kind of reinforce this thought. And then when exhale, then it's a negation of the world. So this is how Shankara proposed how to practice this pranayama, not just by physically inhale and exhale, but to work with the thought.
Oh, that's from Sankacharya, is it?
Yeah, Sankacharya. Yeah, I'm sorry,
Okay,
sorry for pronunciation. And also, Anya, would you like to share some of your comment or thought on the quotation I just have about the veracity in the Patanjali's Yoga Sutra?
Excuse me, you would like me to comment on what, sorry?
Oh, so I have one question about that quotation.
In the chat box, have you posted in the chat box? Let me just...
Earlier,
would you read it, please? Or that might be quick.
So it's from the 36. When veracity is complete, the yogi becomes the focus for the karma resulting from all works, good or bad.
Very good. Okay. Yes. Yes, it is partially what I think Will explained before. Veracity meaning truthfulness. I mean, this really applies to everything we do. But if you, at certain point in your life, decide to really commit to the truth, so you cannot lie to yourself anymore. When you do something for the wrong reasons, you have to admit it, and basically your whole attitude changes. You suddenly start seeing maybe little games that people try to play with you and so on and so forth. You need to find yourself in this new position. And because, well, let's say it's ruthless, truth can be quite ruthless, the whole process of your spiritual development speeds up. Because it's like you stop beating around the bush. You go directly to the point of things, to the essence of things. And that's why it will, karmically, it will work much faster. Does it answer your question a little bit?
Yeah, thanks for sharing. Yeah, okay, thank you.
Okay, well, let's just read a little bit more about pranayama, because that's what Lei was talking about, asking about. So who'd like to read the next 2-3 paragraphs? Any volunteers?
Yes, I'll do it.
Yeah, thank you, David.
Sorry, from where are we going?
On pranayama.
On pranayama. The life winds are the various modes of out-breathing and in-breathing, changing thereby the polarity of the body and states of consciousness. It is yoga practice, but be aware of taking the exoteric works on yoga literally. They all require a key. That's from Transactions of the Blavatsky Lodge. The utmost that can come of pranayama are some psychic powers of a trifling nature, which most often are misused by unbalanced minds. The followers of the inner path have therefore eschewed this as dangerous and undesirable. This misadventure generally ends in theomania, if not insanity. I think theomania means believing one is God or a God.
That's right.
Divine, especially if one is not. Clearly, on one who had harmed themselves psychically, his own self-painted adeptship is entirely imaginary. He has nevertheless, by the injudicious practice of pranayama, developed in himself to some extent mediumship, is tainted for life with it. He has opened wide the door to influences from the wrong quarter, and is henceforth almost impervious to those from the right. That's from a letter from Mahatma K.H. On the chakras, or the astral centers, nerve centers along the spine, spinal column, I advise you to discontinue concentration on the vital centers, which again may prove dangerous. You have some power of concentration, and the greatest help will now come to you from concentration upon the higher self and aspiration toward the higher self. Concentrate your mind upon that. For example, a phrase in the Gita or other text, and meditate upon it. You will find much good results from it, and there is no danger in such concentration. It's the letters who have helped me by Mr. Judge. And just as one may injure his body by ignorantly using drugs or physical practices, so can the finer currents and nerves of the inner man be thrown out of adjustment if one, in ignorance, attempts, uninstructed, to deal with them. So that's from Judges replanting diseases. And on Kundalini, arousing the Kundalini and forcing it up to the Brahmarandra, the crown of the head, and thus acquiring the power of walking on water and of prophecy, do not constitute a spiritual man. Such is not fit to be a chela or a disciple. That's from the Bhavani Shankar's doctrine of the Bhagavad Gita. Kundalini is one of the mystic yogi powers. It is buddhi considered as an active instead of a passive principle. Thus, the electro-spiritual force, called Kundalini, is the result of the spiritual development of man and has nothing to do with the physical and mechanical processes. So that's from Bhavani Shankar also.
Great, thank you very much, David. So we've time for just one question. Are there any questions about the chakras or the Kundalini? There's a subtle connection, by the way, between the chakras and the Kundalini, which we heard that quotation from Judge earlier. The centers seem to be the communication paths for the Kundalini, and they seem to be somehow involved in the generation of impulses that feed up and down with the Kundalini. Oh, Leigh's raised his hand.
Here's also some about Kundalini, and I cannot find. I was trying to search that article, but cannot find it from the I don't know how to pronounce his name. Damoda.
Oh,
He's one of
Damoda.
Damoda. Yeah.
Yeah.
As I remember, he's from Damoda, and he talks about Kundalini. He said actually there is a higher Kundalini and a lower Kundalini, and most of people talking about Kundalini these days is the lower Kundalini, which is located at the bottom of our spine. And everyone when they do the Kundalini yoga, they're trying to rise this, and this is very dangerous. And for the higher Kundalini, which is at the heart, and for the aspirants to go, they are right. White practice or white magic should focus on the heart Kundalini, not go to the lower Kundalini.
It was Bhavani Shankar who wrote
Bhavani Shankar? Okay, sorry.
in those terms, but the way he writes about them can be misleading in that it implies that there's two separate individual Kundalinis within the human being, whereas HPB doesn't make that distinction. And the voice of the silence uses that phrase, the Kundalini must be allowed to retire into the heart chamber, which means it's not there already. It has to rise up and then be allowed to retreat into the heart. And it says, and then from the heart, it shall rise up to the head.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you.
Tatiana. I mean, I think, Leigh, what Bhavani Shankar was talking about is that there may be one Kundalini, but two qualities. You know, as you rightly said, the lower Kundalini may not be very.
That's very dangerous. Kind of, if you rise, you got very infinite power, but you also those arrogance of those negative feelings, negative emotions will also rise and can lead to a destruction of self.
That's right, and that's the problem. Is that if unless you've mastered your lower self through the early limbs of Patanjali, forbearance and observances, then when the Kundalini rises, it's going to be out of control because you haven't slain the dragon, as it were. So this part of the seminar is going to focus on the last three, the highest three limbs of Patanjali's system. And we're going to have 2 short talks, 10-minute talks, and then an opportunity to discuss them and read some quotations. So let's hand over to, I think it's Steve as the first talk.
Yes, thank you, Will. I wanted to point out that we are taking part really in a 3-week endeavor to bring us to the 21st of March, where we have a commemoration day for the life of William Quan Judge. And in the calendar, it says William Quan Judge and the real esoteric Raja Yoga. The subject of yoga runs all through WQJ's writings. Is Theosophical Raja Yoga the same as that of different Hindu systems? How does yoga relate to white, black, and gray magic? We'll explore the help available from H.P. Blavatsky's most trusted colleague. The notion of the practices of equanimity and meditation really arrives from the notion of being a student in general of the old path as presented to us by the founders. The Mahatmas through WQJ and H.P. Blavatsky, Crosby, the founder of the ULT. And it's easy to tie in the last 3 yamas, the last 3 of the limbs, or that is not the yamas, the last 3 of the limbs, attention, contemplation, and meditation in regards to this, to the first 2, ahimsa, nonviolence, satya, of the yamas, truthfulness, asteya, non-stealing, the brahmacharya, abstention, essentially, and detachment, as well as apargaha, non-coveting, also detachment. These also connect to the Buddhist precepts with the perhaps the removal of the brahmacharya state and the addition of non-taking of substances. But knowing Theosophy as not another dogma, but simply the truth as known by awakened men and women who were previously ignorant of the actual relationship and understanding of man and nature, as we are to a degree now. Therefore, there is a trusted basis upon which these ideas are anciently rooted and can therefore be used as that to which all other thought can be compared. Then, having satisfied oneself that this is true, one moves on to practice such ideas that have been presented here. This is obviously an important process, and as those who have done it can attest, it does require a degree of fearlessness to just let go of timidity and adopt a state of trust. The adoption of false ideas hinders our exterior growth in relationships, they being the reverse of what is real and thus illusion. And from Book 2 of Patanjali, page 24, verse 17, we find, from the fact that the soul is conjoined in the body with the organ of thought, and thus with the whole of nature, lack of discrimination follows, producing misconception. Which is very much like the Noble Truths, the first being the realization of a kind of suffering simply through incarnation, by being a human being. And the second one, where one takes these studies seriously enough to realize that our suffering is from ourselves through cause and effect. Though our mind and many minds of people today are aimed very much in effects, in the process of simply making and creating and doing, etc., involving ourselves, uninvolving ourselves, getting sick and not getting sick, yet overlooking the fact that the decision making is within the individual who is experiencing the karma. We are therefore, as the second Noble Truth says, the cause of our own karma. This truth adopted by the intellectual man can have only beneficial effect upon the material man. Then the manas consciously becomes the path between itself and the real man. Thus, the basis, perhaps, for equanimity is a simple, important thing to remember is that we are seeking equanimity, and a degree of it must initially exist before meditation. In other words, how are we to know what we are experiencing unless we have some basis of it? The practice of the first limbs, the yamas, is a practice that's not taken up perhaps out of idealization, although it has been done throughout history by great thinkers such as Gandhi and his movement on ahimsa, the satyagraha. It is also taken up as the basis for what the higher nature is. It's the reason we look. It's the reason we want to have equanimity. So the practice of meditation and yoga, and particularly Raja Yoga, is really allowing ourselves to experience what the inner nature of man is. It's what we ought to be. So the voice of the silent says, "For mind is like a mirror. It gathers dust while it reflects. It needs the gentle breezes of soul wisdom to brush away the dust of our illusions. Seek, O beginner, to blend thy mind and soul," says the voice of the silence. And actually earlier on, it says the mind is the great slayer of the real. Let the disciple slay the slayer. The meaning here sounds a bit circular and hard to get out to begin with. But the notion here is that the obstructed mind, as Patanjali would put it, in which the process of putting ourselves in a position to experience genuine yoga is the removing of the obstructions of the mind. That the mind obstructed sees the real in false light. The disciple, who would be one who lives in the higher nature, must slay the mind. So part of the practice for gaining equanimity and therefore meditation as a pre-existing state is to practice the philosophy we've given ourselves to, and to see and compare, one might say, what we're being taught here in comparison to what life is like. And then the voice says, "Be humble if thou wouldst attain to wisdom. Be humbler still when wisdom thou hast attained." Though this speaks of the basic tenet of humility, wherein the individual realizes that he's quite unaware of the causes in his own life, but he's aware of a cause. And being aware of that, he needs to come to grips with the fact that the mind that he's been using, and in which case, and where everything takes place for him, needs to be dealt with in some normal, I say normal with quotes, but in some sense of equanimity before attempting to sit and think seriously about or meditate. And so the book says in the preface, Patanjali's Yoga Aphorisms, and this is also on the handout, "In order to understand the system expounded in this book, it is also necessary to admit the existence of soul and the comparative unimportance of the body in which it dwells." And further on it says, "And as he lays down that the real experiencer and knower is the soul and not the mind, it follows that the mind, designated either as internal organ or thinking principle, while higher and more subtle than the body, is yet only an instrument." So though we are constantly thinking, constantly before we go to sleep thinking, constantly remembering, it's important to try and take the stance of being a pure conscious entity who actually uses the mind as a place, as the field of operation, where ideas are looked at with as much clarity as possible, often dispensed in groups of unattached notions, which could be attached and may not, but need to be followed to their source and dismembered, you might say, and allow them to disintegrate into lighter particles without any adhesion of attention. So the way to some extent, and this is an interesting point, is that the balance required in the mind is that we understand that we need to pay attention to what's happening, but not so much so that what is there, the obstructions, remain, because it's our attention to obstructions, being fooled by them, where we're rather wrapped up in the obstruction itself. So we have to see ourselves as that which is not the obstruction. Further on in the handout, and part of our discussion, is number 15 from the first book of Patanjali. Dispassion is having overcome one's desires. And the dispassion is a disconnection of oneself to what one feels and what one thinks one needs. It is where karma has less of a hold over us. And then further on down in 17, there is a meditation of the kind called that in which there is distinct cognition, and which is of a fourfold character because of argumentation, deliberation, beatitude, and egoism. And Mr. Judge says here, which is not in the handout, the argumentative division of this meditation is a pondering upon a subject with argument as to its nature in comparison with something else. As for instance, the question whether mind is a product of matter or precedes matter. And one can use this perspective to look at the thoughts that we're thinking and try to decide which precedes us, the thought or myself. Did I really make a decision to think this was true or not? And as nitpicky as this is, but it's the kind of state of mind which brings about the very equilibrium we're looking for. And secondly, Judge says, the deliberative division is a pondering in regard to whence have come and where is the field of action of the subtler senses and the mind. So this is truly treating the mind as a tool, so to speak, rather than what we think we are, or by default, being that mind. And 3, the beatific condition is that in which the higher powers of the mind, together with truth in the abstract, are pondered upon. This requires obviously a sense of knowing the truth in the abstract. And these principles are referred to as in Theosophical writings and discussions such as this on a regular basis. And by testing ourselves, comparing that thing which is presented to us as truth to what we think we know, and then daring to let go of what we think we know for just a bit enough to give the thing we've been given as truth, to see if it stands up. Is it holding water in our lives? This is going on during meditation, regardless of the ideas that come up, but it also has to be somewhat of a normal perspective before trying to. And from another point of view, then meditation or attention, concentration, ekagrata, which is single-mindedness, becomes a practice we can begin to adopt slowly but surely throughout the daily round. Fourthly, the egoistic division is one in which the meditation has proceeded to such a height that all lower objects and objects are lost sight of, and nothing remains but the cognition of the self, which then becomes a stepping stone to higher degrees of meditation. This is more or less having spent some time truly contemplating what is in the mind as a field of ideas, and one by one removing them, or accepting them as reality as they fit in comparison to what we have held as truth, and thus ending up very quickly, if it can be done, as time is not much of a problem in this circumstance, when the truth that we have held high become trusted as that, then that which isn't simply falls apart, very much like clouds in relation to the sun in the sky. The result of reaching the fourth degree, called egoism, is that a distinct recognition of the object or subject with which the meditation began is lost, and self-consciousness alone results. But this self-consciousness does not include the consciousness of the absolute or supreme soul. To some extent, this connects, because Judge is saying it in relation to verse 17, to the general theosophical teaching that though an individual can realize the logic, one might say, and the isness in some way of an absolute which precedes and in fact does not exist in relation to any of what we call manvantara, and that condition exists in ourselves to some extent, as the higher self is indeed not caught up at all in all of the material representations of it in the lower man. Still, the individual is more or less confined to the world of his highest spiritual consciousness, which is not unknowing of the great absolute, the Maha state of absolute. Not a problem for most of us, but nonetheless, it's important to realize that what one thinks is God in ourselves is not that, which is the greater absoluteness, but a representation of it to some extent. Finally, let me go to 33, verse 33, which says, and this connects easily to the previous limbs we mentioned, the first two limbs. Through the practicing of benevolence, tenderness, complacency, and disregard for objects of happiness, grief, virtue, and vice, the mind becomes purified. Thus the practice, one might say, of the right, the benevolence, tenderness, complacency, and disregard or detachment for objects of sense, is the opposite. It's the exact opposite of those things which we may have been attracted to. We may have had tendencies towards anger, or in fact, isolationism, where in fact we couldn't connect to others, regardless of the pandemic, or complacency, in which it was very hard for us to move, in which we were very filled with a kind of inertia. The opposite of that is the benevolence, the tenderness, complacency. Complacency here meaning quite happy to be where we are, which is a different notion regarding home, feeling at home in the world of our own karma, one might say, and knowing full well that we have the power to do something about it. He says, finally, the chief occasions for distraction of the mind are covetousness and aversion. And what the aphorism means is, not that virtue and vice should be viewed with indifference by the student, but that he should not fix his mind with pleasure upon happiness or virtue, nor with aversion upon grief or vice in others, but should regard all with an equal mind. And the practice of benevolence, tenderness, and complacency brings about cheerfulness of the mind, which tends to strength and steadiness. An interesting thing we ran across in the great treatise of the stages of the path to enlightenment by Tsongkhapa. He says, if you are one who abides in the Bodhisattva lineage, or that is, in the spirit of enlightenment, you naturally have a few dysfunctional tendencies. Once you have developed the spirit of enlightenment, the dysfunctional tendencies of your mind and body are slight. You are patient and gentle, so that if someone harms you, you bear it, and do no harm in return. If you see others hurting each other, you are very displeased. You seldom give rise to anger, jealousy, deceitfulness, concealment, and the like. If these do arise, they are not intense, do not last long, and quickly disappear. Finally, he says, accordingly, understand that the spirit of enlightenment comprises the key points of all the Mahayana's personal instructions, is a great treasure of all the spiritual attainments, is the feature that distinguishes the Mahayana from the Hinayana, and is the excellent basis that spurs you to undertake the greatly effective bodhisattva deeds. So we can test ourselves by how we are according to the practice. And we can test ourselves on a regular basis as to how quickly we can settle into a state of this complacency, as spoken of in verse 33, where we're quite at home to think, and to think about ourselves quite clearly. And the practice of this makes of the mind, we think, a genuine stepping stone to the self. It removes the obstructions. It makes the sutrakma something of a genuine pathway between the two manasas, as we're told. And it's important to image in a way the fact that the lower man in which we practice and live our daily lives is in fact a product, a representation, a symbolic representation of the higher self. It would have no life otherwise. Thus the state of equanimity we would like is well practiced before actually even sitting and practicing in contemplation those ideas such as brotherhood, peacefulness, universal welfare, ideals which need to be thought about, but to which equanimity to begin with is a helpful tool.
So we're now going to have a second half of the last talk: attention, contemplation, meditation, union with the divine. David's got that for us.
So thank you, Steve, for that. Will or Laurent, could you please post the diagram of the 8 limbs for me on the screen?
Can you see it now?
Yes. Thank you, Anya. So friends, as we have seen, the yoga system of Patanjali's 8 limbs or Ashtanga, 8 limbs or disciplines, is a comprehensive and integrated system which, if pursued regularly and consistently, will gradually lead the aspirant ultimately to the goal of union with the divine, will transform the animal man into a divine man. The 8 limbs should all be practiced simultaneously, but ultimately the last 3 limbs are the culmination of the whole process. After the mind and the body have both been brought or trained to a state of calmness and stillness or restraint, described by the Hindu, the Sanskrit word sanyama, when the body remains in a steady, comfortable posture or position, and the wavering mind has been cleared of the vrittis, or the rampant brain waves or impressions which usually color the mundane, the everyday mind. The aspirant is now able to focus on a single point, idea, image, or concept. Regular practice is recommended either in a fixed place or in a mental place, which cannot be seen, or at night. But whichever, however one practices it, it should be at the same time each day, morning or evening, and thus a regular habit is created, not only physically but also mentally. At first, this may be difficult for some, but with practice will grow easier. The attention, so the culmination of the whole process is the goal and the aim of complete reabsorption into the higher self. These last 3 limbs, simply put, are attention, contemplation, and meditation. I'll take the first one, attention or dharana. The attention should be directed within. Just before I said on the comfortable posture or position, this can be either sitting in the lotus position on the floor or in a chair, but whichever one chooses, the spine must be straight and erect, the head must be up, the hands may be placed in the lap or on the knees, but usually with palms facing upward. So that in a sense the body is parked, is placed aside for the moment, but in a maintainable position, a viable position, which will not interfere with the inner attention. The attention should be directed within, selecting a thing, a spot, or an idea to fix the mind on. This is known as dharana. This could also be called concentration. Dharana can also be described as introspective focus and one-pointedness of mind. The root of the word is dhar, to hold, maintain, or keep. It is the holding of one's mind onto a particular inner state, subject or topic of one's mind. The mind could be fixed on a mantra or one's breath, a place or an object one wants to observe, a concept or an idea. Fixing the mind means one-pointed focus without drifting of mind and without jumping from one topic to another. The next stage or limb or level is contemplation, or the holding or the focusing the mind on it. It could also be described as meditative absorption or dhyana. Dhyana literally means contemplation, reflection, and profound abstract meditation. Dhyana is integrally related to dharana. One leads to the other. Dharana is a state of mind. Dhyana is said to be the process of mind. It is uninterrupted train of thought, current of cognition, and flow of awareness. The final stage is known as samadhi. This is complete meditation, a union and integration. One becomes totally immersed in the object of meditation. Samadhi is also further defined as literally meaning putting together, joining, combining with union, the harmonious whole, and trance. Samadhi is oneness with the subject of meditation. There is no distinction between the eighth limb of yoga, during the eighth limb of yoga, between the actor of meditation, the act of meditation, and the subject of meditation. Samadhi is that spiritual state when one's mind is so absorbed in whatever it is contemplating that the mind loses its sense of its own identity. The thinker, the thought process, and the thought fuse with the subject of thought. There is only oneness of samadhi. These practices are said to develop an accurate discerning power, which is a distinct faculty not possessed by those who have not practiced meditation. Patanjali also speaks of the power of discrimination which is developed, which is perfect discriminative knowledge possessed by the man who has attained to the perfection of spiritual cultivation is of 7 kinds up to the limit of meditation. So depending on the level the aspirant has reached, there are seven levels of this discrimination faculty. Ultimately, this leads the aspirant to the recognition of the extra dimensions of the human consciousness, which come beyond the intellect. These practices, if pursued, also will lead to the awakening of the higher soul faculties, senses, and powers, known as the higher idis. And Patanjali in Book 3 and 4 goes into more detail into each of these particular abilities or higher powers. Ideally, these develop spontaneously as one proceeds in one's practice. So they arise naturally, and as opposed to being forced by other dubious methods. And in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna points out that the aspirant, I quote, "He who with devotion fixed on me," meaning Krishna, or the Lord Ishvara within, the spirit spark, said to be located in the heart, also described as the Om. He who with devotion fixed on me over time finds spiritual knowledge springing up within spontaneously. So again, this is a spontaneous, natural event or occurrence brought about by these practices. So that concludes my part of the talk.
Thank you very much, David. So we've got 20 minutes till the end. Or should we let's take some questions first. Anyone got any questions about the 2 talks?
I was wondering if, I know that we've talked about how the masters can know anything through their development of themselves. And so it almost seems like it's through these 3 developments to actually know something and be in union with it. Then that's how they would, I just all came together for me that that's how they would actually fully know anything they put their focus on.
Yes, that's right, Laurie. And actually, in the aphorisms, Patanjali describes these abilities. He speaks of one of them is the power to read the mind of an ant, simply by concentrating on that. At another level, a power which is developed, or ability developed by focusing on the heart, the hridana, enables one to be able to read the minds of others. Of course, one is not allowed to interfere with another's thoughts, but with this faculty one can obviously discern truth from lies and see things as they truly are. And but you're right. This, we could call it a heightened state of consciousness, or even superconscious in a sense, which these practices develop.
Oh, I'll just add to that that perhaps the freedom of mind, which leads towards knowing and not being fooled by illusion, is based in the decision made early on in their lives as chelas, as disciples, amongst the two paths. That is to say, they're not looking for freedom of themselves from all the problems, from the earth, etc. They're really looking for freedom of mind to understand. And that decision, I think, has something to do with their ability to know and to care, because their basic concern is the compassion for humanity, making them the Nirmanakayas, who had the opportunity to choose nirvana for a time, timeless time to us, so long it would be. But nonetheless, they've chosen to stay and to help. And to do that effectively, you actually would have to have a freedom of mind that is free of illusion.
I was wondering if we could relate Laurie's question to what we know about the centers or the chakras, because from what we read from Judge, all these chakras have are centers of perception. So you've got the lower chakras in the body, which were not encouraged to focus our concentration on. We should leave the bodily chakras alone because they represent the more material aspect. And then you've got 7 other chakras in the head. And it's those ones that are the spiritual chakras. They're not much spoken about in the New Age, but it must be through those chakras that we get this spiritual vision coming. Some of you may know that Judge wrote about William and Elizabeth Denton. They were psychometers, and she was exceptional psychometer, and she used to put something up to her forehead. It could be a bit of marble. I think one was a bit of marble from Cicero's Roman villa. And she was able to describe what happened in that villa, and she put it up to her forehead, I think. And by putting it on that center in her forehead, she was able to get a vision of the whole history of that piece of marble, what had happened to it, what was impressed on it.
Yes, it said these higher faculties or CDs are latent in the chakras, or the and these practices awaken them, so they can be used. I mean, these are almost godlike abilities. I mean, if you read through Patanjali's list of them, it's quite remarkable what the human being is ultimately capable of doing, and yet it is largely cut off for most of us, because we our whole attention, or most of our attention, is on the lower planes, on the astrophysical level. The lower manas are very much concerned with survival, competition, or acquiring possessions, and so on. But yet everyone, this is ultimately available to all who would follow this path. You see. And as even if one person follows this path, it's said he helps to lift up the whole body of humanity, that as he perfects himself or gains enlightenment, gains this divine status, he lifts up the rest of humanity and provides a model or example for others to follow.
Yeah, thanks, David. So Anya has her hand up, and then there's a question from Sunny in the chat box.
Thank you, Will. I've got a question. I guess the whole warning that comes from theosophical teachings against, for example, Hatha Yoga, and this cyclic opening that might be, I hope, in most cases, an unwanted result of practicing Hatha Yoga. Does it come, well, basically, in our development to this spiritual enlightenment, do we have to go through this psychic realm? I know that in the Voice of the Silence, they talk about the whole of learning in between. Does it mean that every aspirant, every chela has to go through this period, and the more aware we are, the faster we will get through it to the whole of wisdom? Or is there a way to avoid it altogether?
Yeah, good question, Anya. Steve, do you want to say something on that?
My first inclination is that getting through it as an idea is a mistake, in the sense of expectation or thinking what it is that we're getting through. Because to some extent we don't know. And that doesn't mean to say that it hasn't been known or not gone through by others, but it means our own path is quite individual. Thus, self-clarification through the processes we've been speaking of brings about kind of a natural sense of process based in its own time, and that the patience required to go through that, one of the paramitas, is what it takes to absolutely, in a way, not be concerned for outcomes, as the Gita speaks.
Yeah, good. Very good.
Yes, and I think depending on your karma, what you achieved in your past lives, I think we do all have to go through this stage to transform these lower energies or vibrations or the lower nature through these practices into the spiritual nature, the true nature, actually, because it's something we had aeons ago. We had already reached this level of consciousness or and ability. We were gods originally, but we descended or we chose to go through the pilgrimage of the soul through physical incarnation, and also in living in the physical plane with all of its pressures and stresses, its own tendencies, which affect us. But this is the raw material we have to deal with, really. In order to to find the diamond within, we have to cut through the coal that surrounds it. Perhaps that's a good way of putting it.
Yeah, thanks, David. So we've got a question from Sunny. Should a certain level of concentration be attained before we even attempt to meditate? You've replied to that, Steve. Yes, saying that you must have a sense of equilibrium. Don't know if you want to add to that.
No, except that to say that what comes along with concern about the truth and untruth, illusion, perceived, etc., is the notion of having concentrated enough to realize that to begin with. Or when reading the Voice of the Silence, you go from page to page, concentrating on what's being said so that you can move further with understanding. And it's that striving for understanding, the search for meaning, you might say, that I think really naturally precedes meditation, but is already a part of it.
Anya put it well in her, I think it was the one actually, Anya, with the green background and the...
With yamas and niyamas. Okay.
Yes, that's it.
Green.
The last one of the yamas, or the niyamas, was this fervent turning towards the divine, the renouncing everything in favor of the inner life. Oh yeah, there it is. Surrender or persevering devotion to the Supreme Soul. That's the one. Yeah. So I think that's that concentration allows you to develop this devotion to the Supreme Soul.
Just another thought, this concentration is to some extent like a laser. And as I was thinking of the mind as the sky with clouds, at first we perceive the sun on the other side of the clouds, and then assuming the position of the sun, the clouds just burn off. Thus concentration is in reality an act.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. And so we ought to just finish with the last one, or there's two comments, one from Laurie. We talked about there being 7 levels of the astral as well, perhaps through the paramitas or 8 limbs, keeping one pointed on the union of the lower with the higher, which helps us keep lifted in the astral realm to higher levels. Yes, that's right. We have to try to build that antaskarana bridge that transfers our consciousness over the bridge from the quaternary up into the Trinity. In the voice of the silence, it speaks beautifully of the deer, which is our consciousness is like a deer, and it's chased by the hounds, the barking hounds, fiends, I think she calls them. And then the deer jumps over the bridge or the moat, and then it's safe inside the castle. And then the lower consciousness, which is represented by the barking hounds, the dogs who are chasing, they can't, once the deer is in the stronghold of the higher ego, they can't be touched. It's like the antaskarana bridge is pulled up behind the deer, and it's safe from the lower self. And then Matiana's put something in on the astral light from Judge. Would you like to read that, Matiana?
Well, I posted that in response to the question of, is it necessary or essential for everyone to have to pass through the psychic stage? And he said Theosophists inclined to dabble in mediumship and desiring sightseeing should remember the statement of HPB that some of the highest occultists never look into the astral light at all. They would not degrade themselves by passing into that region. But I added that the voice of the silence, however, seems to imply that it is necessary to pass through the hall of learning, the astral psychic realm with its various experiences and sensations, in order to reach the hall of wisdom.
Yeah, very good.
But that doesn't mean deliberately seeking out the psychic experiences. It suggests they will come naturally at a certain point.
Yeah, doesn't it say in the voice we shouldn't tarry in the hall of learning? We shouldn't wait around in the hall of learning.
Yeah.
Yeah, at the second hall, the astral hall.
Could I
yes.
pick up on the S's comment about the
Sunnis, yeah.
meditation in the West? Now, even in ordinary life, to cultivate concentration and the power of attention is important, is essential in order, firstly, to learn anything, in order to gain any kind of knowledge through study or whatever. It requires concentration, a certain and paying attention as well. I mean, like school children are supposed to pay attention to the teacher and so on. So it is not just in meditation that these faculties are important. And the question about meditation in the West, I suppose from one point of view, it could be said it has been degraded into, as he said, just kind of sitting in the lotus position and going within. But what we are describing in Patanjali's Eightfold System is quite a different thing altogether. This is a deliberate spiritual practice based on the principles of yoga, of spiritual knowledge, spiritual science, or even the science of the soul, with a definite purpose and aim involved. It is not just a recreation or something you do for pleasure. I mean, it's quite a serious business, and to do it on a regular basis over many years, I mean, it's quite a discipline to make it a regular habit in your life. I mean, and also to gain that level of discrimination and clarity at the highest level is also something which may not even be achieved, said in one lifetime, may take many lifetimes to reach the level of samadhi. So, it depends on which aspect you are looking at the subject.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, David. So I think we've got to draw it to a close. We'll just hand over to Laurent to wrap up and tell us about Sunday's meeting.
Yes. So, friends, as we have seen in this seminar, the subject of yoga is a very important one, especially the philosophical teaching on yoga, which is an ethical discipline of mind, as we've seen in the eclipse of yoga, which leads the would-be yogi to a state of union between his real ego, Ishvara, as Patanjali call it, the higher ego, another term for it, with his divine and personal self. So we learn that unlike Hatha Yoga, that focuses wholly on bodily exercises and complicated breathing technique, the purpose of which is lower psychic development. Raja Yoga, on the other hand, is what you could call the true royal discipline, a discipline that elevates the human soul, manas to a truly royal state with the focus on the timeless, ageless philosophical ethics. Some of the practice that we've spoken of today is purification and withdrawal of the thinking mind from desire, attachment, and repulsion, control and purification of the senses and the organ which are windows of the soul, right performance of duty without any interest in the result which might accrue, with injunction also implied that one should not run away from the world, and then turning our mind, the mind inwardly toward the spirit, the real actor, the inner man. Those are some of the things that we covered today, which are subject to study and considerations. We also mentioned things about Hatha Yoga and the danger that it might cause to the practitioner, such as like spiritistic mediumship and psychic sensitive, who becomes unconsciously to themselves channel of invisible forces, while the Raja Yoga practice consciously and deliberately use those forces to benefit mankind. But what is the ultimate purpose of Raja Yoga practice once the union with the divine is achieved, we may ask? The voice of the silence summarized this for us in the following sentence. To live to benefit mankind is the first step. To practice the six glorious virtues is the second. To don Nimanakaya humble robe is to forego eternal bliss for self. To help on man's salvation. To reach Nirvana bliss, but to renounce it is the supreme, the final step, the highest on the initiation path. Know, O disciple, this is the sacred path selected by the Buddhas of perfection who sacrifice the self to weaker selves. So thank you to all of you for your attendance and contributions, and have a peaceful weekend in the practice of yoga.